But perhaps even more problematic is that young people across the US and the globe buy into these dangerous messages. Between cell phones, iPads and tablets, violent video games, and marketers selling to us at the bus stop, on the freeway, and in magazine stands, American youth are being sold sex, violence, and gender stereotypes 24/7. US teens in particular consume over 10 hours and 45 minutes of media a day. Scary, isn't it, when you realize they're consuming shows like Toddlers and Tiaras, Keeping Up with the Kardashians, and the Housewives of, well, you name it, XYZ County. In fact, everywhere I go, from the United Arab Emirates to Singapore to Toronto, Canada, to Monterrey, Mexico, to my neighborhood schools, so much of the world is consuming and affected by this tabloid trash. And let's not forget the unnecessarily graphic and gory violent crime dramas on network TV, or the violent video games like Manhunt, Call of Duty, and Grand Theft Auto, where you're participating in violence for the sake of violence, more often than not with women and minorities as the helpless victims. This is wrong. Why? It's just media, entertainment creators and naysayers argue. And yet, media is the most powerful cultural messenger of all. In fact, young people especially absorb the media's messages. We all know by now that the average child's brain doesn't fully develop until they're in their late 20s. So young people have different interpretive abilities and different emotional abilities, making them a much more vulnerable class of citizens. In other words, they don't realize the impact that violent video game exposure has on their reduced empathy to real-world pain and suffering, nor the impact seeing so many hypersexualized women in the media has not only on young girls' self-esteem, but on young boys' perceptions of women and girls as sex objects and therefore their property. As the mother of 3 young children and one on the way, this frightened me to death. So what did I do? I started asking questions and looking at the stats. Did you know that women are a mere 5% of media positions of clout? That means that 95% of what we all watch, read, and hear comes from a limited perspective, a limited masculine perspective. In fact, let's just, for argument's sake, examine the entertainment industry. Despite seemingly positive progress with box office hits like Bridesmaids, The Hunger Games, Frozen, and Trainwreck, women's representation behind the scenes has stalled, if not gotten worse. In fact, in 2014, just 2 directors across the top 100 films were female. Further, there were only 28 female directors who worked across the top 700 films from 2007 to 2014. And of the mere 28 female directors, only 3 were Black and 1 was Asian. The stats among advertising creative directors are much the same. Well, they might be a little worse, but you all know that 3% rings a bell, right? So this is a pattern that starts behind the scenes, creating an unconscious bias that affects what we see on screen. Back to the example of the entertainment industry. It shouldn't surprise us then that only 11% of the top grossing films between 2007 and 2014 were gender balanced, meaning they featured girls or women in roughly half of all speaking parts, only 11%. And a full 74% of all women on screen this past year were white, while only 11% were African American, 4% Latina, 4% Asian, and get this, 4% otherworldly. In other words, audiences were as likely to see a non-human woman as they were a Latina or Asian woman in film. Ironic, isn't it, that Latinas make up 17% of the US population and aliens make up 0.